coming back to your district for your recess session here, the feedback that you've gotten from your town halls and meeting with your constituents, both negative and positive, and sort of your takeaways as you go back to Washington next week to tackle the issues.
Well, I thought it was extremely important to come back and hold a host of public town hall meetings and public forums to listen to what the feedback was from constituents and to talk very specifically about the process of the debt ceiling vote, from the beginning to the actual culmination of the negotiations and then the final vote on the issue. It is certainly a hot button issue for people of all political persuasions in New Hampshire, as it should be, because I think rightfully so, people are upset about the spending levels at the federal level, the lack of a plan to balance the budget, and the inability of Washington to appreciate that people have to live within their means, and that most people do, including communities and states across the country. So when everybody else is doing the right thing and the responsible thing in balancing budgets, making tough decisions, but doing it with a level of distinction, and Washington just seems to continue to borrow and spend more money. Rightfully so, people are angry, and I joined in that frustration. I also see that this is going to be a several-step process. Republicans in Washington are in charge of one half of 1/3 of the government, and it is very difficult to get something passed legislatively that conservatives believe is the right path when we don't have that same philosophical sense in the Senate. We don't have that same philosophical sense in the White House. So I think ultimately we did a few things. For the first time, the debt ceiling was raised with some changes. We did cut spending on the discretionary side, what I refer to as the operating budget. We did put caps in place for the next 10 years. We don't have a requirement for a balanced budget amendment to pass, but we have a requirement for the vote to take place in the House and the Senate. We're working on legislation now, crafting the terminology of that legislation. My hope is that it passes the House with bipartisan support as well as the Senate, and I think the President would be smart to sign that, to support that initiative and allow the states across the country to have that debate on whether they want Washington to live within its means and have a balanced budget amendment.
Okay, so you're back to Washington next week. What are your priorities, your sort of top items for this session?
Well, I think we've got to focus on job creation. We've got to have some predictability at the federal level legislatively. I think we need to be repealing some onerous regulations to send a message to job creators that we want to see them investing in their own companies, creating the opportunity for that unemployment rate to start to come down. But the way Washington can do that, and should do it, is creating an environment where job creators have the opportunity to create those jobs. And the only way to do that is to give them tax reform, and I hope that we bring forward a tax reform package in the House this fall. We certainly will be focusing on repealing some onerous legislation. But we've got to continue our message of reducing spending at the federal level so people can understand that we're not going to raise taxes as a result of high spending, that we're going to try to reduce our spending, and that means reform in the area of entitlements. We have 1.1 trillion roughly is what we're spending on the discretionary side. The remainder of our $3.7 trillion budget is entitlements, and our long-term debt is being driven by Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Those things have to be addressed, and I think the quicker both parties in Washington appreciate that and acknowledge that, the quicker we can get to a solution-based discussion rather than a finger-pointing dialogue, which is what I think the country is seeing right now, and the country is clearly frustrated with that and wants to see us in a more solution-based, result-oriented activity in the Congress.
So right now, both Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Cantor have kind of been emphasizing regulatory rollback. Do you think that there's a good chance that the Senate will pass any of those kind of measures that might make it through the House? You know, what's your thought on the political climate there?
Well, I think it's interesting that the President recently is calling for regulatory reform, albeit small regulatory reform. We're going to continue expanding the scope of the regulatory reforms that he's that he's looking for. But as I see it, the House has always been in favor of reducing the regulatory burden. The President has come on board to a certain extent with that, and I would hope that he would speak with his colleagues in both the House and the Senate and try to get something done for the good of the country. You know, when you have 9.2, 9.1% unemployment, our consumer confidence is at an all-time low, the value of the dollar is at an all-time low, and economic growth is at an all-time low for the first 6 months of this year. I mean, we're talking historic lows. We're not talking one bad month or one bad quarter. We're talking about a potential of a double-dip recession, which would be have an effect on people not for the next 6 months, but for the next 2 to 4 years. So I appreciate that the President has at least acknowledged that regulatory reform has got to be part of the solution. What I hope he does is communicate that rather effectively to the Senate and demand that the Senate expedite anything that the House sends over, because we will be sending every single week regulatory reform bills over to the Senate. And I think the country, it's owed to the country for the Senate to take up the legislation that the House sends over. And the fact that we are willing to work in the regulatory reform arena, where the President has acknowledged step one of economic stability is going to be required, that is going to expect the Senate to act. And I think that people in our country deserve action from the Senate. Again, in the House, we'll be doing it every single week, finding different regulatory repeals and reforms that we feel are going to be appropriate to move the economy in the right direction.
Congressman, you speak of providing a level of clarity to the corporate world, which speaks, of course, to new hiring. If they had some clarity out there, that they would begin to rehire. Excuse me. Our partners to the north in Canada years ago started a gradation down of their corporate tax structure, and frankly, they've kind of gone through this whole financial turmoil quite smashingly right from 2007 on through, and we're still mired. Is there any appetite at all in Congress at all to set forth a corporate tax cut this fall? And if so, in the White House, or do you just think it's not in this president's DNA to say such a thing?
Well, I think history shows that when you do reduce the either taxes on the individual or on the business and corporate side, you see greater economic activity, and that's extremely important to have in order to get us moving in the right direction economically. What that then produces is the greater level of consumer confidence, and we need both. We need economic activity, job creation, which then I think will bring consumer confidence for consumers to be spending more on goods and services. So without those two components, unfortunately, I think you're going to continue to see stagnation at the unemployment levels. Canada has done a very good job of recognizing in a global economy, you have to continue to remain competitive. And one way you can do that is reduce your corporate tax structure. They have done that effectively. The United States of America is now the highest corporate taxed nation in the world. I continue to hear, including this past 2 weeks when I've been back in New Hampshire, from business owners, small and large, that is a real disincentive and a disadvantage for job growth and for competitiveness. So if we're asking a business owner to invest in their own business, in equipment or in human resources, which means job growth, but they can't meet their bottom line requirements, they're going to either stay stagnant or they're going to shrink. They're going to be eaten up by a competitor, which might be from another country. We don't want to see that happen. So in the House, there is a willingness to reduce the corporate tax rate from the 35% that it's now to what I think is a reasonable reduction to 25%. There are those of us who would like to see it lower, myself included, but we feel to get a bipartisan deal or agreement in place, the 25% level is strong enough to be competitive and also to have a bipartisan agreement. There's been a lot of talk about whether we are willing to work together, whether we are willing to compromise. And I think it's important to know that there are members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who do want to do that, who feel that it's important to put the interests of America ahead of the next election or the political dialogue that goes back and forth. And I think reducing it to 25% is a good first step.